Bom dia a todos e boa tarde aos nossos palestrantes de hoje. O meu nome é Cíntia Chaves, eu sou doutoranda em História da Arte pela Universidade Federal de São Paulo, sob orientação do professor Cássio Fernandes e com financiamento da FAPESP. Esse evento é uma iniciativa do Grupo Warburg e Renascimentos, grupo de pesquisa do Programa de Pós-Graduação em História da Arte da Universidade Federal de São Paulo e vinculado ao CNPq. Eu gostaria de agradecer a presença dos nossos conferencistas e de todos os ouvintes em nome do nosso grupo e do nosso coordenador, o professor Cássio Fernandes. É um prazer ter esse momento de debate com vocês. Esse ano, o ciclo de conferências do grupo está sendo organizado por mim e pelo meu colega Lucas Pietra, que irá realizar a mediação do evento de hoje. Eu gostaria de ressaltar que todos podem deixar perguntas em nosso chat, tanto em inglês quanto em português, para que sejam respondidas ao final de todas as falas. Passo agora, então, a palavra ao Lucas e desejo um ótimo evento a todos.
Agradeço, Cíntia. Agora, então, passando para o inglês. Good morning to those joining us from Brazil, and good afternoon to our speakers. My name is Lucas Pietra. I'm a PhD candidate in social history at the University of São Paulo, under the supervision of Professor Miguel Palmeira. And as mentioned by Cíntia, I will be moderating this year's presentations for the International Conference Cycle of the Warburg and Renaissance Research Group. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Warburg and Renaissance Group, based at the Federal University of São Paulo, and in particular, Professor Cássio Fernandes, our coordinator, for welcoming our proposal for this conference cycle. I would also like to extend my thanks to our speakers, Dr. George Brokelhaas, Dr. Eugenia Sisto, and the PhD candidate, William Hawkinson, for accepting our invitation to share their work with us today. Before we begin, I would like to note that we will follow the order of presentations as announced for the event, starting with George's talk and closing it with Will's. Each presentation will last around 30 minutes, and at the end, we will have a further 30 minutes for questions. Well, moving on to today's talks, I now invite Dr. George Brokelhaas to open our session. George is a fellow... Oh, yeah, I can hear you. I just go ahead. It's all right. It's all right. George is a fellow of the Institute of Classical Studies and a researcher with the project Poetica at Southern Methodist University. He holds a PhD in cultural and intellectual history from the Warburg Institute and has published on the Italian Renaissance academies and the history of early modern educational institutions. He holds his book on the humanist Giovanni Pontano and the revival of the philosophical symposium in Renaissance Italy is forthcoming with Bloomsbury, and he's currently working on a critical edition and translation of Peter Ramos' Ciceronianos, 1557, due to come out with Durham University Press next year. His talk today is entitled The Epistemology of Invention in Ramos' Logic. George, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Lucas. Thank you, Lucas and Cynthia, for having us here today. I'm going to talk about something that a lot of Warburgian scholars have discussed in the past, from Francis Yates to Charles Schmidt, Peter Mack, which is this peculiar mental procedure called invention, or the method of Loki, or sometimes the topical art. I want to start my presentation with a myth. So this is a myth that gets repeated in medieval histories of the arts about this wise man. Sometimes he's a titan, sometimes he's a kind of philosopher, sometimes he's a desert hermit called Parmenides the Egyptian. Parmenides spent 15 years on a rock inventing the art of dialectic. The origin of dialectic, according to this legend, is based on a sort of hallucinatory misreading of Martianus Capella, who wrote in his Marriage of Mercury and Philology that dialectic was invented in Egypt before passing into the Eleatic school of Parmenides the Greek. At a certain point, sometime around the 11th century, according to Klibanski, a scribal error gives birth to Parmenides the Egyptian, whose character then gets embellished with each subsequent iteration of the legend. The 13th century abbot of Cirencester, Alexander Neckham, writes that Parmenides, while deeply engrossed in contemplation on his Egyptian rock, discovered these 7 supreme first principles, which lie hidden dialectically in the lap of nature. Neckham goes on to identify Parmenides as a titan, and not only that, but the brother of Prometheus. If it was Prometheus who brought fire down from Olympus and taught humanity the mechanical arts, Parmenides correspondingly drew the rules of dialectics from the lap of nature and so created the 7 liberal arts. Aristotle defined dialectics as the art of reasoning well, assigning to it 3 uses: mental training, conversation, and what he calls the philosophical sciences. In Aristotle's system, every dialectical procedure begins with invention, where you look within your soul to find the arguments and premises concerning whatever it is that you want to reason about. Anyone here familiar with Francis Yates' work on the art of memory will know this technique as it was used in classical mnemotechny, where you visualize an inner space, a palace, a cathedral, garden, or forest, and populate it with mnemonic images, loci, which prompt the recollection of submatter. Yates and other historians of memory have demonstrated that during the Renaissance, the art of memory declined, as the classical authority on this art, the Rhetorica ad Herennium, was exposed as apocryphal, while the rise of the printing press and other artificial machines for remembering rendered the memory palaces redundant. The thesis I'm going to be presenting today is that an opposite movement took place in Renaissance dialectic, that is, from the exterior into the interior. In Renaissance dialectic, we see the technique of topical invention elevated from a merely psychological heuristic for finding material to reason with to a scientific method in its own right. So after reviewing the ancient and medieval backgrounds to this technique, I will discuss the decline of Aristotelian dialectics and the rise of humanist dialectics in the 16th century, considering how dialecticians such as Rudolf Agricola, Philip Melanchthon, and Peter Ramus mentioned than demonstration the basis method. I will claim that these thinkers forged a radically new model of dialectical, one which prioritized actions, predictive logic. The relationship between dialectical reasoning and truth was debated among ancient philosophical schools. In both Aristotelian logic and rhetoric, the term invention, heuresis, denoted the mental process of collecting arguments, premises, distinctions, and lines of reasoning relevant to the subject about which you wanted to discourse. Invention supplied the material for inquiry, which for the rhetorician was useful for constructing probable statements called enthymemes, or for the logician, scientific demonstrations, syllogisms. In both dialectical and rhetorical reasoning, not to get too deep into this, Aristotle places numerous steps between invention and knowledge. In his system, the topics of invention are merely psychological prompts that do not themselves create either probable or certain knowledge until they have been organized into logical statements. Aristotle's aim was to make dialectics as responsible to the truth as possible, and his dialectic provides a sophisticated set of formal rules for judging the probability of a statement and whether it is scientifically true or not. The other major ancient school of dialectics relevant for the Renaissance is that of the academic skeptics. Unlike Aristotle, the skeptics did not believe that the mind could ever reach certain knowledge, still less express it in language. For this reason, they saw no need to maintain the Aristotelian distinction between and syllogism, that is, between forms of reasoning that produce probable knowledge and forms of reasoning that produce certain knowledge. As Charles Schmidt showed in his study Cicero Skepticus, the philosophy of ancient skepticism, transmitted via its chief Roman intermediator Cicero, exercised a major influence on Renaissance humanism in its crusade to discredit the grand scientific claims of high scholasticism. At the time when he wrote his treatise on the art of invention, Cicero had recently converted to skepticism, having studied under the head of the academy, Philo of Larissa, during the philosopher's exile to Rome. In the De Inventione, Cicero defines the topic of invention as the labels under which any thing, res, can be mentally categorized according to its every possible attribute, definition, genus, species, property, etc. There are about 12 of them. Cicero makes invention one of the 5 so-called canons of rhetoric, alongside memory, arrangement, style, and delivery. The orator, by mastering the technique of invention, was able to mentally summon the material for any case that he wished to plead. At the same time, the philosopher can also use invention to devise all the probable arguments in favor or against a given position, a technique that Cicero called in utramque partem, on both sides of an argument. As such, Cicero dissolves the Aristotelian distinction between dialectical and rhetorical invention, which he is justified in doing because from the perspective of academic epistemology, all knowledge is probable and all forms of reasoning can only approximate but never arrive at the truth. Cicero collapses the epistemological gap between thinking and knowing, reducing the number of steps necessary between inventing a topic and gaining knowledge of something. In his Topics, Cicero wrote that the topics of invention are prior in order of nature to the judgments that we form of them, meaning that we know things. Eloquence, he says, other than wisdom speaking copiously. To understand how dialectical invention was transformed from an art to a science, we must consider how the tradition of scholastic Aristotle. The modern logic, logica moderna of the late Middle Ages, rested on the dialectician's conception of his subject as the subject of discourse. Dialectics were focused on the semantics of terms, their meaning both in themselves and in relation to other terms, and it was categorized neither as a science of reality, the scientia realis, nor a science of reason, scientia rationalis, but wholly as what was called a science of linguistic entities, scientia sermocinalis. According to the scholastic system of the sciences, this made dialectic not a science of first intentions, i.e. a science whose contents were directly abstracted from reality, but of intentions, which is one concerned with secondary psychological objects. The purpose of dialectics was to teach the student to detect and refute fallacious reasoning, and it was a propedeutic for pursuing later studies in natural philosophy, metaphysics, and theology. Dialectics, therefore, within scholasticism, ranked secondary to those forms of scientific demonstration, which the humanists claim were primarily a tool for formal linguistic disputes with no basis in experience or real knowledge. So I've shared this all too condensed and caricatured history of the art of dialectic to highlight one unresolved epistemological tension in the tradition of the ars inveniendi before the Renaissance. Aristotelian dialectics theorized invention as a purely discursive technique for extracting the raw data out of which logical propositions are constructed to produce either probable knowledge or scientific knowledge. The Roman dialecticians, meanwhile, who inspired the Renaissance, were less concerned with proving the scientific validity of their inventions than with establishing probability, a quality that Cicero defined as something invented to create belief. So now we move on to our first major watershed in the Renaissance reform of dialectics, pioneered by the Italian humanists Lorenzo Valla in his Repastinatio Dialecticae et Philosophiae. Valla thought that the time was overdue to get rid of everything that had become barren and infertile in scholastic dialect, Gothic apparatus of syllogism, sophismata, and restoring the art to its classical simplicity. In the Repastinatio, Valla follows Cicero in reducing dialectics to two movements, invention and judgment, shifting the focus of dialectical reasoning away from demonstrating scientific facts forming persuasive arguments. However, at several points in the work, Valla appears to go further than Cicero in justifying the epistemological power of topical invention, as suggesting that it is also a way to obtain metaphysical knowledge. Valla rejects the subtle ontological distinctions of scholastic metaphysics, the so-called six transcendental terms, which defines the different ways that something can exist, either as being, one, true, good, or merely. The commonsensical that any object that exists can adequately be summed up just as a thing. And in the Repastinatio, he does not distinguish between being of res, to a logical thing, and res as the subject of discourse, the matter that gets invented when we go into our minds and try to construct the material of an argument. As such, Valla interprets the system pene verba sequentur, lay hold of the thing and the words will follow, as an epistemological rather than a rhetorical statement. And he suggests that by inventing the thing, one has grasped its true being. In reducing physics to simply res, Valla makes it possible for later dialecticians to regard invention, the mental process of laying hold of a thing, as a procedure adequate to metaphysical inquiries. In Vallan dialectics, topics are not only a heuristic aid for the human mind, but also in some sense a reflection of some ontological order. Nevertheless, the general orientation of Valla's dialectic is instrumentalist rather than theoretical. Valla is interested in language as a vehicle for communication, debate, and persuasion, and he evaluates arguments in terms of their usefulness and persuasiveness rather than their formal validity or demonstrative power. The Repastinatio is a manifesto for intellectual reform, not a fully thought out program of dialectical study. And its epistemological statements, whether they incline to a kind of Ciceronian skepticism or some form of innatist realism, are secondary to Valla's polemical aims. All the same, in the subsequent tradition of humanist dialectics, we will see begin to develop a kind of best of both worlds approach, as Valla's successors attempt to formulate a dialectics that is both based on natural language and also capable of producing scientific certainty. The new approach to dialectic inaugurated by Valla was carried forward by the Low Countries humanist Rudolf Agricola in his De Inventione Dialectica, completed in Padua in 1479. This work was a 16th century bestseller, with 44 editions and 32 editions of epitomes appearing within 60 years of the 1515 Editio Princeps. Adapting a Ciceronian framework, Agricola unites dialectical and rhetorical invention into one universal system of knowledge, as he seeks to transform the ars inveniendi into a method of scientific inquiry, rather than a propageutic to science. Compared to Valla, Agricola had what we might call a philosophically curious, if not a very philosophically sophisticated form of mind. Unlike his Italian predecessor, Agricola engaged in good faith with the major scholastic problem of his time, namely the problem of universals, whether concepts exist purely in the mind, as nominalists such as William of Ockham proposed, or whether, as the followers of Duns Scotus held, they were a priori real. Though the De Inventione Dialectica does not address the problem of universals in any explicit way, the 1539 Cologne edition of the work is prefaced by a short treatise by Agricola entitled Several Questions About Universals, a subject to which the editor tells us Agricola had planned to dedicate an entire book. In this treatise, Agricola argues for a radically realist position, claiming that universals inhere in things and can be directly known through our cognition of them. As Lodinauta has recently argued, Agricola's account of the art of invention in the De Inventione Dialectica frequently gestures to a realist position, as Agricola speaks in very non-Ciceronian terms of the loci as revealing the nature of things, or even the intimate and hidden nature of things. Though the function of topics in Agricola's dialectic is argumentative and rhetorical, their roots are metaphysical, as he more or less explicitly acknowledges himself. So the topics of invention become identified in Agricola's system with things in themselves, reflecting a philosophical worldview in which mental objects refer directly to ontological realities. While more or less maintaining its simple argumentative schemes, Agricola uproots the skeptical underpinnings of Ciceronian dialectics and establishes invention within an epistemological framework of realism. In the Agricolan worldview, the loci of invention function almost like Platonic ideas. They're not only psychological constructs which prompt discursive thought, but realia, whose cognition makes things known as they really are. In this way, Agricola transforms the art of invention into a method sufficient for gaining certain knowledge about the objects of one's inquiries. In the 16th century, the De Inventione Dialectica came to rival the Aristotelian Organon as the central text of the dialectic class in the universities of Northern Europe. Among Protestant teachers, the Agricolan method of topical invention gradually took the place of Aristotelian logic as the chief method of undertaking inquiry in the sciences of natural philosophy, metaphysics, and theology. The German reformer and professor at the University of Wittenberg, Philip Melanchthon, was the first to make dialectical invention the basis of a systematic theology in his 1521 magnum opus, De Loci Communes Rerum Theologicarum. Mounting a direct challenge to the epistemological underpinnings of scholastic Aristotelian dialectic, Melanchthon warns in the preface to the first volume of the work, "Do not think that the commonplaces are to be invented casually or arbitrarily. They are derived from deep structures of nature, and they are the sets of patterns to which all things correspond." For Melanchthon, the places are not just conventional thought markers, but signs that point to deep structures of nature. To make topical invention a suitable method for addressing questions of theology, Melanchthon had first to explain how this simple mental operation could be made to yield certain and not merely probable knowledge. Melanchthon says that because man is made in the image of God, the loci communes, those topics that pertain to moral praise and blame, contain the rules for living a Christian life. He writes that in deliberative and judicial speeches, there are commonplaces, certain rules of life naturally convincing to people, which I would not hesitate to call laws of nature. That is, maxims so self-evident that, being commonly conceived, they express nothing that the listener can deny. In Melanchthon's outlook, the moral law that was brought down on tablets of stone from Mount Sinai was first transplanted into the human soul in the form of the loci communes. This amounts to a kind of rhetorical theology, where the topics of invention become vehicles of divine wisdom implanted by God. Melanchthon marries a Protestant emphasis on the individual's personal relationship with the divine with a humanistic model of dialectical cognition. As the creation of God, the individual mind contains the direct means of access to knowledge of divine matters, specifically moral law. Though, unlike Agricola, he does not go so far as to speculate on the ontology of the loci, Melanchthon reduces the distance between inventing arguments and deriving truth from them. Whereas Aristotelian scholastic dialectic required that arguments be expressed in the form of syllogisms before their certainty could be established, Melanchthon makes invention alone sufficient for gaining theological knowledge. We can detect in the development of Protestant dialectics a new attitude to the epistemology of invention. where the scholastic dialecticians figured invention as a purely psychological process for gathering material, which then had to be subjected to further reasonings in order to produce knowledge, the humanists regarded the mental data discovered in invention as themselves repositories of knowledge, which had only to be discoursed upon to be made intelligible to others. A tendency to philosophical realism, originating with Valla and Agricola and then given a distinct Protestant theological spin by Melanchthon, made humanist dialectics distinct from Ciceronian dialectics, where invention is only ever approximate to truth and never able to grasp it with full certainty. The humanist tradition of dialectics reaches its consummation with the work of the Parisian logician and educational reformer Peter Ramus. In the middle years of the 16th century, Ramus and his collaborator Omer Talon led a campaign to abolish the teaching of Aristotle at the University of Paris and to replace it with a program of humanistic study capable of efficiently training teenage boys in the arts of the trivium. Ramus began his career publishing a master's thesis inventively titled Why Aristotle Was Wrong About Everything, and continued his career in a similarly pugnacious vein. By the turn of the 17th century, Ramism had triumphed as the dominant educational paradigm in Protestant Europe, with over 1,100 printings of works by Ramus and his collaborator produced between 1550 and 1600 alone. In 1543, Ramus published his Dialecticae Institutiones, the same year, incidentally, as Copernicus's De Revolutionibus and Vesalius's De Humani Corporis Fabrica. Ramus's system of invention closely follows the model of dialectical reasoning laid out in Agricola's De Inventione. Like his humanist predecessors, Ramus omits the predicables, the categories, a significant portion of the syllogism, and most of the alternative forms of argumentation, including induction, enthymeme, example, and sophism, leaving only the loci of invention. Ramus' dialectic consists of two movements, invention and judgment. Judgment is also known as disposition. So in invention, you find arguments, and in disposition, you place them into a sensible order, and then you use that as material discourse. After inventing all the topics related to the matter at hand, be it a forensic case, a literary work, a sermon, or whatever, the loci were arranged in the form of a Romaean bracket or skeleton, as you can see on the slide. In this system, you have one master topic, which gets divided into an array of subtopics until you have disposed everything that could possibly be said about that subject. In this way, according to Ramus, the loci become evidence to the mind absolutely prior in nature, clear and better known in such a way that we can determine the correspondence they all have among each other and are more easily received and retained in the memory. Ramus called this system natural dialectic and contrasted it with the artificial dialectic of the Aristotelians. He calls it natural dialectic because it is supposed to describe how humans think naturally. The skill of reasoning, according to Ramus, is innate and perfectible by art and practice. Like Melanchthon, Ramus provides a theological rationale for this innatist epistemology. In the Dialectica, he writes that because God created logic and structured the cosmos according to it, all created things are in theory logically intelligible to the human mind, which is an image of the mind of God. For Ramus, quoting St. Paul, the natures of all things are connected by the divine logos, through which we live, move, and have our being. As such, by using what Ramus called his one and only method, the individual could gain knowledge of everything completely, omnium omnino rerum. Modern critics have been damning of Ramism and have positioned its triumph over the old Aristotelian logic as a major step on the road to what recent historians of science have termed the mechanist, materialist, objectivist worldview. If the Vesalian Revolution, according to this line of thinking, promoted a mechanistic view of human embodiment, and the Copernican revolution revealed man's cosmic insignificance, the Ramist revolution substituted for his inner mental language the reified and mathematized language of the bracketed diagram. This case is made by the Jesuit historian Walter Ong in his book Death of Dialogue, which argues that because Ramus taught his method of topical invention with the aid of printed diagrams, his dialectics had the effect of detaching knowledge from the interior space of the mind and mapping it onto an apersonal schema, reducing, to quote Ong, the personalist dialoguing element in knowledge to a minimum in favor of an element that made knowledge something a corporation could traffic in. In Ong's view, therefore, there is no interior speculative life that holds Ramism together. Similarly, in her Art of Memory, Frances Yates makes the case that by substituting for the imaginative techniques of classical mnemotechny the abstract imageless schema of the bracketed diagram, Ramus depreciated the role of interior knowledge and imagination. As a side note here, in honor of Lucas, I wanted to share what I found here at the back of the Warburg's copy of Ong's Death of Dialogue, which comes from the library of D.P. Walker. There's some notes that Lucas tells me are in Yates's hand, which suggests to me at least that she takes her negative assessment of Ramism directly from Walter Ong, rather than from reading Ramus himself. When it comes to Ong's central thesis, Yates seems pretty skeptical, and she notes in one place relation between invention of printing and increase in diagrams, question mark, question mark, something as frequent and elaborate in manuscripts as printed books, question mark, question mark, question mark. If I can run with Yates's skepticism here, the idea that just because Ramus used diagrams, he had no sense of an interior speculative life runs entirely contrary to the aims of his natural dialectic. I would argue rather that compared to the Aristotelian logic that it replaced, Ramism is actually radically interiorized. The Ramist doctrine of natural dialectic dictates that truth already exists, just waiting to be found within our souls. In Ramist dialectic, there is no demonstration, only eloquence, that speaking forth from the places in the mind which were put there by a logical God for us to discover. Perhaps the most powerful distillation of this doctrine of natural dialectic that I've been able to find, I wanted to end on this note from the orator by the Ramist Johann Henrik Alsted. Alsted writes that just as the stars are found each one in its place, which is the sky, fishes each in their own place, which is water, so in the common places, each subject is found distinctly and completely. The strength of Nemazune is built on both nature and art. So questions about demonstration, certainty, being, and truth definitely did not much stir the curiosity of the Renaissance humanists. The reason that so many of them favored a dialectic of topical invention to the predicative logic of their scholastic forebears was because this provided a more suitable preparation for the kinds of literary and professional pursuits that they were interested in. In the humanists' eyes, the syllogism was of less use to the orator, the lawyer, or the poet than was the ability to discourse eloquently and spontaneously about a large range of topics. However, this is not to suggest that thinkers such as Agricola, Melanchthon, and Ramus were entirely innocent of epistemological commitments, as Walter Ong says they are. The Renaissance dialecticians, as I hope to have shown, developed a subjectivized and existentially inward approach to dialectical reasoning and cognition, in opposition to a scholastic logic which seemed to exceed the limits of natural thought. For the Renaissance humanists, therefore, as for Parmenides the Egyptian, logical truth is not demonstrated, but found inside the soul. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, George. And moving on to our next speaker now, I invite Dr. Eugenia Sisto. Eugenia holds a master's degree in philology, literature, and history of antiquity from the University of Turin, Italy. She has recently completed her PhD at the Warburg Institute in London, and her doctoral thesis was part of the project Writing Bilingually, 1465 to 1700, self-translated books in Italy and France, led by Dr. Sara Miglietti. Eugenia's research interests include Neo-Latin and Italian, the history of language, translation studies, and the intellectual and cultural history of early modern Europe. Her presentation is entitled Early Modern Self-Translators on the Move, the Case of Prospero Bogranucci. Eugenia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So before jumping into the fascinating world of self-translation, I would like to thank Cynthia and Lucas very much for organizing this conference and for inviting me to share my research with you today, to show you what I've been working on during my PhD and what I'm currently planning to do. The topic at the center of my paper today is the relationship between the literary phenomenon of self-translation and experiences of geographical displacement, that is the relocation of intellectual outside the Italian peninsula, which could happen for different reasons, such as exile, study abroad, or missionary activities, among others. Scholarship on contemporary self-translators significantly highlights such an association of bilingual practice and geographical displacement. However, this connection is often overlooked in analysis on early modern self-translation. Through the case study of the Italian physician Prospero Bogranucci and a brief overview of other Renaissance authors, my goal is to demonstrate how early modern self-translators engaged in questions of identity and self-representation, triggered by geographical mobility through the practice of self-translation. My interest in this topic stems from the research project I was part of, conducted for my PhD. I was part of the project Writing Bilingually, led by Sara Miglietti from January 2023 to March 2026 at the Warburg Institute. And now I'm going to tell you a bit more about it. The second part of my talk will offer an overview of the theory of self-translation and geographical mobility in contemporary and early modern case studies. Lastly, I will investigate the work of a Renaissance physician, Prospero Bogranucci. But first, we need some definitions. What exactly is self-translation? Self-translation occurs when an author composes a text in one language and translates it into another. Self-translation is a modern term that did not exist in the early modern period. Like much of the terminology used in the Writing Bilingually project, it stems from contemporary translation studies. However, early modern self-translators did use other expressions to refer to this practice. For instance, the Italian author Pietro Bembo spoke of rendering in the vernacular what he had written in Latin, while the title page of the self-translated work by the Italian Jesuit Antonio Possevino reads, first published in Rome in the Latin language and recently made into Italian by the author himself. Self-translation has captured the attention of scholars over the last 50 years. However, the existing scholarship mostly focuses on contemporary practices of self-translation. Pioneering investigations have focused on authors such as James Joyce, Samuel Beckett, Vladimir Nabokov, Milan Kundera, and Umberto Eco, establishing theoretical frameworks to examine self-translation nowadays. There are a few collected volumes which focus on specific early modern cases, such as Mario Turchetti's chapter on Jean Baudin's self-translation, or Francesco Forlan's analysis of Leon Battista Alberti's self-translated treatises. Before the Writing Bilingually project, there was no monographic study of early modern self-translation, nor a unified census. My PhD thesis was deeply intertwined with the aims, methods, and research questions of the Writing Bilingually project. The overall aim of the project was to investigate the phenomenon of self-translation by compiling a comprehensive annotated catalogue of prose self-translations produced in Italy and in France between 1465 and the 18th century. Here, you can see some of the self-translators identified and collected by the project. However, it is not comprehensive yet. There are more works out there to be discovered and identified. On this slide, you can see the database available online. The printed catalog and anthology of the project are currently under review with Brill and will be published soon. As part of the Writing Bilingually project, my PhD aimed to offer a monographic study about the interplay between Latin-Italian self-translation and the scholarly debate surrounding the search for a unified literary Italian language in Renaissance Italy. Although my main focus was not on the relationship between self-translation and geographical displacement, several bilingual authors I analyzed in my doctoral research also underwent experiences of mobility and displacement. The relationship between writers' engagement in self-translation and their physical relocation has already been explored with regard to contemporary self-translation, but still overlooked for the early modern time. Although we need to be careful not to apply modern patterns to 16th century authors, reflecting on contemporary self-translation provides valuable insights into the contextual factors that motivated authors to self-translate in the past and today. Contemporary self-translators often undergo an autobiographical experience of displacement. Exile triggers a linguistic crisis, which self-translators navigate by creating different language versions of their work. In the 20th century, self-translation was a common practice among authors of migration and exiles, including such well-known cases as the Danish author Karen Blixen, the Russian-American Vladimir Nabokov, and as many as 9 Nobel laureates, among whom Samuel Beckett and Luigi Pirandello. Francesca Duranti, an Italian writer, published 11 works of fiction. She was a trilingual author, writing in German, in Italian, and in English. She learned German as a child, even before learning Italian. In an interview, she revealed that she rejected the German because it was the language that represented a separation from her mother. She wrote Sogni Mancini in Italian and later translated it into English as Left-Handed Dreams. Her choice of English is connected to the fact that Duranti chose to spend part of the year living in New York, which therefore represents her experience of a new home. She used the self-translation as a means of regeneration. Scholars studying contemporary self-translation argue that the shift from one language to another has 3 possible consequences. First, there could be a loss of self and a betrayal of the first language. Second, the self-translation could be a means to find a true sense of self. Third, self-translation could represent an in-between space where the author deconstructs and nurtures the self. However, I argue that these 3 processes did not necessarily apply to Renaissance self-translators, as the status of Latin and the vernacular differed from that of contemporary languages. Latin functioned as a widely learned and used lingua franca, free from association with any specific national identity. As a result, shifting language from Latin and to Latin didn't represent a betrayal of the original language, nor a discovery of a true identity. 16th century authors embraced both their Latin and vernacular personas, shaped by the bilingual environments in which they lived, while still adopting and adapting them to their specific target audiences. Self-translation could represent a form of meditation for Renaissance writers. For instance, the self-translator Giannozzo Manetti argued that self-translation allowed him, and here I quote, to go once again through the process of soul-searching and overcoming of pain he had experienced while writing the dialogue in the first place. Several factors prompted authors to self-translate: relationship of patronage, the gift economy, career strategy, and the dynamics of the printing market. And, as in the case of contemporary self-translators, geographical displacement also encouraged the early modern authors to engage in bilingual writing. Hawkinson and Manson have identified exile, royal exile in particular, as a reason why writers in the early modern time self-translated. They have highlighted that condition of exile ran through translation history of the early modern era like a leitmotif. I have identified some medieval and Renaissance Italian self-translators who experienced the physical mobility and geographical displacement as well. The Florentine Brunetto Latini, here in the slide, who was also Dante Alighieri's mentor, composed a didactic poem, De Tesoretto, in Italian, in Florentine vernacular verse precisely, which he partly translated in his Livre du Trésor in prose in the Langue d'Oil, the medieval French spoken in northern France. Latini produced both works when he was exiled in France for his political views on Florence. What interests me is Latini's decision to deliver the work not only in the language of the country, France, where he was exiled, but also in his own native tongue. As we shall see, such an association of bilingual practice and geographical displacement was not unique to Latini, nor was it confined to experiences of exile. It also characterized the work of other bilingual authors who moved across Europe for reasons other than exile. The case of Prospero Borgarucci is particularly remarkable because his autobiographical experience of mobility significantly encouraged and shaped his self-translation, raising questions of identity. His self-translated work can be seen as an autobiographical act, both stricto sensu, as Borgarucci talks about his life experiences, and lato sensu, as he adapts his content to each language version, aims to maintain control of his work, and reflects on his linguistic identity. Borgarucci was born in 1540 in Canziano, a small town in central Italy. He became a physician, then professor of anatomy and surgery at the University of Padua. He was also an established editor and author engaged in vernacular transmission of learned medicine. Borgarucci dedicated his life to extensive travels abroad, engaging with an international network of scholars. Among his many travels, he resided in London, Paris, Flanders, likely attending university in Leuven and Antwerp around 1562. Borgarucci moved to London and worked as a physician of the local nobility. During his time in London, the plague spread out. Borgarucci wrote a treatise about the plague, its symptom and its remedies, the peste. He first wrote it in Latin and then translated it into the vernacular. Both versions were published in 1565 in Venice. In his technical treatise, Borgarucci reports autobiographical details, which I divided into 4 categories: travels, networks, professional practices, and personal judgments. Although we lack detailed information about his life and career, the peste allows us to reconstruct a more comprehensive profile of Borgarucci. By reading his treatise, we discover that he stayed in Paris. Borgarucci indeed recounts, and here I quote, "In Paris, where I have stayed for several months on other occasions, I have continually found that there were people afflicted by the plague." End of quote. Borgarucci visited some regions in France, such as Picardy, Burgundy, and Normandy. He also tells us that he visited his brother in London when the plague spread out. Always being on the move, Borgarucci built a wide social network around Europe. I created a second category, which collects all the passages where Borgarucci talks about his family and the milieu he belonged to. He writes about his mentor, Bernardino Paterno, and his brother, Giulio Borgarucci. Borgarucci is eager to meet other physicians. He says, and here I quote, "Indeed, many times I have left good and dear company and remained completely alone in order to meet some great man, and from them retain some useful memory for myself. At times, I have remained for several days waiting to meet some famous physician, always with the aim of learning and through learning of benefiting others, as everyone ought to do in every profession." When changing language of his treatise, Borgarucci also changes details about his professional practices. He reports experiences from his career as a physician, and I have grouped these narratives under the label professional practices. For instance, he discovers a new treatment. He states, and here I quote, "Beyond all these prescribed medicines and the many other remedies and provisions described above, there still remains another remedy that I myself discovered and tested, which I do not wish to omit for two reasons. It is one of the most excellent remedies that can ever be found, not only for curing those afflicted by the plague, but also for preserving the healthy and for anyone who wishes to use it." End of quote. The fourth kind of autobiographical content that stands out in Borgarucci's treatise concerns personal judgments. Borgarucci condemns the practice of reporting information that is already well known to everyone. Thus, he aims to deal with new and useful content. He argues, and here I quote, "Nor indeed have I taken the trouble to write about those things that are clear and evident to everyone. For to say everything that everyone already knows is not altogether something to be praised, nor is it necessarily a sign that one seeks only to benefit the world." When changing language of his treatise, Borgarucci is also changing its content, communicating a different image of himself. Overall, the Latin version contains more references to classical sources. On the other hand, the vernacularization more frequently mentions 16th century physicians such as Pietro Andrea Mattioli, Jacques Charpentier, and Giacomo Antonio Cortuso, who are absent from the original Latin version. The Latin version is more objective, while the vernacularization incorporates personal reflection, likely to better engage the common readers. In the vernacular version, Borgarucci does not hide his criticism against specific medical treatments. He states that he disapproves of physicians who recommend drinking cold water to their patients, as it could have harmful effects on the body. The Latin version, on the other hand, does not include this personal judgment. Thus, while the Latin version conveys a more neutral image of the author, the vernacularization provides a fuller and closer portrait of Borgarucci's character and life. The choice of language creates opportunity for autobiographical expression. Since the Peste doesn't explicitly address the discourse on Latin and the vernacular, I will refer to other works by Borgarucci that offer theoretical reflections on language. Borgarucci wrote two long treatises in the vernacular, La Contemplazione Anatomica and La Fabbrica degli Speziali. In the anatomical contemplation, Borgarucci blames those authors who refuse to share the secrets of philosophy and nature, so that only the most elevated minds can access them. He argues that, and I quote, "They openly declare that the secrets of philosophy should not be written in the common language of the people, nor should the things of nature be revealed through clear and straightforward explanation, so that such precious matters are not disclosed to minds that are less elevated. Rather, they should be reserved only for the sublime few. And so, on the contrary, I have resolved to treat these matters in our Italian language, so that everyone can take satisfaction in reading them on their own, without the trouble of learning foreign and ancient languages." In his preface of the La Fabbrica degli Speziali, Borgarucci states, and here beginning of quote, "As long as the profound concept of doctrines is expressed, it can be appropriately done in any language, nor is it true that one is more noble than another, for they are all the same, provided that they are intelligible and expressive. However, some languages are more noble because in one more than in another, various brilliant minds have written excellent works." End of quote. Borgarucci then adds, and I quote, "Why beg for what belongs to others if I can make use of my own? Isn't my language a beautiful language? Does it not express every great concept brilliantly? What matters that I write in Latin if I can do the same in Italian?" Borgarucci believes that all languages are the same as long as they are intelligible and expressive. However, it's undeniable that some languages are perceived as more prestigious than others, such as Latin. Here, Borgarucci takes a stand. He recognizes the prestige of Latin, but also emphasizes the value of Italian, as his time is wonderfully full of renowned writers, as he says. Borgarucci also states that Italian can express meanings very clearly, while Latin makes authors seem educated even when they are not. When Borgarucci wrote his medical treatise, Latin and the vernacular still held a different level of prestige. The theoretical remarks Borgarucci makes about the Italian language reveal his preference for the vernacular. However, he chose to write the Peste in Latin first. This decision depended on the readership he wanted to target. Borgarucci dedicated the Latin version to his two brothers, Bernardino, who was a jurist, and Giulio, who was also a doctor. Borgarucci addressed the Latin version not only to his two brothers, but also to the Universum Urbem Christianum, the entire Christian world, as he states in the preface. That is to say, the international scholarly community. On the other hand, Luigi Firpo argues that Borgarucci's vernacular works aim to profit from a socially wider Italian audience, not just scholars. Borgarucci wrote two language versions of the Peste to address different readership while keeping control over its content. We might wonder whether the author's role changes when self-translating a text for a different community of speakers with the aim of reaching a readership different from the original one. Borgarucci might have seen himself as belonging to both communities, the English European network of physicians and the Italian general audience. But he was also aware of the need to adapt the content and language of his work, as well as the image of himself that he conveyed through it. His experience of mobility shapes and is shaped by his engagement in self-translation. Borgarucci's travel did, in fact, prompt him to embrace both his Latin and vernacular personas in order to reach two communities, the international and the Italian. At the same time, the autobiographical account of his travels was shaped and modified through the self-translative process, creating two distinct literary versions and consequently two different images of the same author. Borgarucci is not the only case of an early modern self-translator on the move. There are other Renaissance authors who experienced geographical mobility, though dictated by dramatically different circumstances, such as persecution and exile. I'm going to mention one case and in regards to persecution, and another case of proactive missionary activity. The experience of physical mobility of these authors profoundly shaped their linguistic views and choices. The translation was also practiced by writers who had to flee Italy and settle in different parts of Switzerland for religious reasons during the Catholic Reformation. The Italian Protestant Francesco Negri moved to Chiavenna, a small town situated in the valleys of Grisons in southeastern Switzerland, to escape religious persecution in the 1530s. Negri's precariousness as a relocated intellectual undoubtedly shaped his linguistic choices. He employed both Latin and the vernacular in his output. Negri's best-known work is the tragedy entitled Free Will, which he first published in Italian in 1546 and later self-translated into Latin in 1559. The desire to convey reformed ideas to Chiavenna's lay body of the faithful, largely ignorant of Latin, and more broadly to audiences across the Italian peninsula, prompted Negri to employ the vernacular in the first place. The Latin translation, published after 10 years, followed at a time when the work was beginning to gain success, some international recognition, and had already been translated into Greek and French by others. Another case involves the Jesuit Antonio Possevino. For Antonio Possevino, by contrast, geographical displacement took the form of a voluntary choice as part of his missionary activity to spread Catholicism abroad. Among religious intellectuals living the Italian peninsula, there were Catholics too, although for reasons different from those of the Protestant exiles. Jesuits undertook journeys abroad to spread Catholic teachings and fight Protestant ideas. Possevino became secretary of the Jesuit order and carried on diplomatic tasks across Europe, in Sweden, Poland, Muscovia, and Transylvania. His travels influenced his literary production, as he reported his missionary activity in his self-translated works, Commentario di Transilvania and Moscovia. Possevino acknowledged the value of the vernacular as part of his missionary activity, advising its use when one lacked education in Latin. This is indeed the case of the princess to whom Possevino addressed his Transylvania. This work is considered as the first systematic geographical and historical description of Transylvania, and is particularly relevant to the present analysis, as it not only provides evidence of Possevino's use of the vernacular based on his readership, but it also further reveals the author's engagement with self-translation. Only the manuscript of the original vernacular version survived. However, there is explicit evidence that Possevino projected a Latin translation. Let us now draw some conclusions. The condition of these authors as expatriates, although arising from different circumstances, including forced exile, periods of study abroad, travels, and missionary activities, encouraged them to engage in metalinguistic reflection in order to address readers both abroad and in the Italian peninsula. The case of Prospero Borgarucci has shown how experiences of mobility could prompt authors to reshape both their works and their authorial identities through the production of different linguistic versions. In adapting their works to different target audiences, early modern authors also negotiated questions of identity and self-representation. This suggests a significant connection between early modern authors' engagement in self-translation and their experiences of mobility, which deserves to be explored further by collecting more case studies. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Eugenia. Today, I now invite William Hopkinson. William holds 2 master's degrees, one in ancient history from King's College London, where he specialized in the study of the late Roman Republic and classical reception, and another one from the Warburg Institute in cultural, intellectual, and visual history of the Renaissance, where he specialized in Italian Renaissance philosophy and political thought in the 16th and 17th centuries. He's currently in the 2nd year of his PhD at the Warburg, researching for a project entitled Aristotle and the Italian Renaissance Utopianism, Virtue in the City, 1526 to 1627. And William's general research interests include utopian studies, intellectual history, and the history of philosophy and political thought in the Italian Renaissance, with a special interest in vernacular Aristotelianism. His presentation is entitled Between Imagined Ideal and Cultural Reality, La Repubblica Brutuliana. Will, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lucas, for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here, to be able to present my research. I must, of course, give special thanks to Lucas and to Cynthia for inviting us all here to talk today. The paper I'll be giving right now is an extension of the first chapter of my PhD thesis on the Florentine humanist and translator Antonio Brucioli. The title of my thesis, as Lucas already said, is Aristotle and Italian Renaissance Utopianism, Virtue and the City, 1526 to 1627, which explores the reception of Aristotle's ethical and political doctrines in Italian Renaissance utopian thought in the period, working under the supervision of Jill Cray. I want to begin by saying a few words about why Antonio Brucioli is important and why his work is worth closer attention than it has already been given. He is best known for his Italian Bible translations and commentaries on Holy Scripture, but his dialogues on moral philosophy, as I hope to demonstrate, also merit credential. The most prominent contribution in these dialogues and of particular interest for me is entitled Della Repubblica. In it, Brucioli proposed a utopia with a distinctly Aristotelian flavor. The text also evolved from the first edition in 1526 to the later editions in 1537/38 and 1544. While the nature and constitution of his ideal state remained largely unchanged, other features of the dialogue were modified or omitted entirely, so that the text became more grounded in the Florence of Brucioli's own day and moved away from intricate narratives, exaggerations, and distortions of the contemporary reality to a practical and realistic style of utopian writing, which was more akin to Aristotle than to Thomas More or Plato, and which can also be found in a number of other contributions to Italian utopian thought in the 16th and 17th centuries. Here's the outline of my talk. First, I'll give a brief introduction to Brucioli and his cultural and intellectual background, which formed the basis of his desire to construct a utopia. Then I will mention his achievements as a translator before discussing his dialogues on moral philosophy and focusing in on his utopian dialogue, Della Repubblica, and the various changes it underwent from its initial publication in 1526 to the later editions. Next, I will investigate the nature of Brucioli's ideal state and explore the major influence which Aristotle's political and ethical philosophy exerted on it, before concluding with some comments on Italian Renaissance utopianism in general. Brucioli's formation as a humanist was shaped by two main influences. Firstly, his relationship with his mentor, Francesco Catani, and secondly, his involvement in the meetings at the Rucellai Gardens in Florence. Under Catani, he was exposed to the philosophy of Aristotle, which Catani filtered through the Platonic tradition as a way of synthesizing and harmonizing the two ancient philosophers. While Catani is traditionally regarded as a Platonist, Aristotle played a substantial role in his thought and his teaching. As he once said to his students, "We have Aristotle, our vigorous leader, who in his book, The Nicomachean Ethics, which we will expound in detail this year, most amply and meticulously paves and fortifies the path by which we should ascend to the heavens." In the meetings at the Rucellai Gardens in Florence, which Brucioli frequented as early as 1513, his humanist education was refined and developed. The later editions of his dialogues, in which the interlocutors are his contemporaries, this is an important detail that I will discuss later on, are one of the most useful accounts for identifying the participants in these intellectual gatherings in the first and second decades of the 16th century, during which a number of themes relating to politics and its moral foundations were deliberated by prominent Florentine figures, including Machiavelli. This intellectually rich period of Brucioli's life came to an end in 1522 when he was forced into exile following his implication in a failed plot to assassinate Cardinal Giulio de' Medici. Brucioli fled to Venice before continuing to Lyon and moving through the free German cities, where he encountered the reformed ideas of Luther and Martin Bucer. He returned to Florence in 1527, but was banished again in 1529 for publicly professing Lutheranism and for organizing a revolt against the Dominican brothers of the San Marco convent. Brucioli was put on trial for heresy on 3 separate occasions. In 1548, after his first trial, he was exiled and settled in Ferrara, which was a safe haven for Protestants at the time, before returning to Venice. At his second trial in 1555, he was forced to abjure his heretical views. He was imprisoned at his third trial in 1558, though his sentence was commuted shortly afterwards. However, he remained under house arrest for the rest of his life. He died in Venice in 1566, very likely in a destitute condition. In 1561, his wife referred to his state of extreme poverty, estrema miseria. His 3 heresy trials were largely due to Brucioli's vernacular translations of and commentaries on Holy Scripture. However, he also made Italian translations of Cicero, Pliny the Elder, and most notably Aristotle, whose impact can also be observed in his literary and philosophical writings. His interest in Aristotle can hardly be overstated. He produced more Italian translations of the philosopher than any other author in the first 3 quarters of the 16th century, and most actively between 1547 and 1558. He completed the first vernacular translation of Aristotle's 8 books on politics in 1547, which became compulsory reading in the schools of Padua shortly after. Padua being, at the time, the stronghold for Aristotelianism in Italy. The influence of Aristotle, along with several other ancient and contemporary authorities, including Plato, Cicero, Seneca, the Stoics, and Machiavelli, can be seen in his dialogues on moral philosophy, which he published in 3 editions, first in 1526, then in 1537, and finally in 1544. He also published other collections of dialogues during these years in various editions dealing with natural philosophy and metaphysics, to which he gave a distinctly religious character. The 30 dialogues of the first edition of his dialogues on moral philosophy were written while he was taking part in the discussions at the Rucellai Gardens and during his subsequent travels through France and Germany as an exile. Several of the topics covered belong to the 3 traditional divisions of moral philosophy: economics, politics, and ethics. Bruccoli's utopian dialogue, De Repubblica, is the longest in the collection, while the second longest is the following dialogue on the laws of the Republic. From the first edition of De Repubblica in 1526 to the 2 later editions, the dialogue was modified in several interesting ways. Apart from the usual minor editorial changes, Bruccoli apparently decided to streamline the dialogue. For example, in the 2 later editions, following the discussion of the distribution of communal goods, a lengthy section setting out the finer details was omitted, with the main interlocutor saying that rather than carry on talking about this matter indefinitely, it would be better to move on and make most of the day. The first major difference between the first edition of 1526 and the second edition of 1537 is that the fictionalized classical interlocutors, Teofane, Valerio, Cratipo, and Teone and Carmene, were transformed into Bruccoli's contemporaries from the Rucellai Gardens: Bernardo Salviati, Gian Giacomo Leonardi, Gian Giorgio Tresino, and Machiavelli, who were retained in the final edition of 1544. The significance of Bruccoli's decision to change the interlocutors to his Florentine contemporaries in De Repubblica is that it connects the dialogue to its origin in the Rucellai Gardens and reflects the nature of discussions held there, which included, among other topics, ancient political institutions and the form of the best state. Crucially, though, these discussions did not aim at discovering the perfect state on the basis of abstract philosophical considerations, but were chiefly concerned with devising a state that was suitable for Florence and the issues they believed it faced. In the later editions of the dialogue, the aims of these new Florentine contemporary interlocutors are more closely tied to the city of Florence. This can be seen in the passages here from the interlocutor Tresino, who on 3 occasions, which I've highlighted in bold, refers to the potential friction that could arise between the model they will propose and the Florentine status quo. Bruccoli's contemporary interlocutors undertook the task of constructing a utopia specifically designed to be a new Florence, to challenge the current system and to provide remedies for what they perceived to be its pitfalls. This was not an abstract vision for a fictional classical city or an unspecific Italian city-state, but rather a utopian program designed with Florence in mind. Given the change of interlocutors and references to contemporary Florence, the opening passages of the first edition of the dialogue unfold very differently from the later editions. In the 1526 edition, the fictional classical interlocutors are described as exiles who have been, quote, driven out by every injustice under the sun, end quote, and they theorize about their beloved republic from afar. Although Carthage is mentioned, they meet in an unspecified location. In the later editions, the Florentine interlocutors congregate in Pesaro at La Villa dell'Imperiale, where they waste little time in beginning their inquiry. Throughout the rest of the dialogue, this new ideal republic is described in all its aspects, from its various magistrates, the nature of its citizens, its size, laws, and military practices. The final section is a discussion of the city's climate, which is consistent from the 1526 edition to those that follow. In the 1526 edition, however, following the discussion of the city's temperate climate, the interlocutor Carmene informs his partners that he has in fact visited a place where such a republic might be founded. He says, "Would you like me to tell you I've seen a republic that struck me as being in keeping with my imagination, both for its strength and for its practicality?" To which Teofane eagerly replies, "Indeed, we would urge you to do so." to which Carmene says, in Mathien, one of the 5 islands of the Moluccas, which I sailed for 4 years with Magellan. Carmene is referring to the famous voyage to the East Indies led by the explorer Ferdinand Magellan in the service of the Spanish crown, which departed from Tenerife in 1519 and returned to Seville in 1522. The main aim of this voyage was to find a westward route across the Pacific to reach the Spice Islands, also known as the Moluccas, which Brucioli here calls the islands of Monteluce. This voyage, which claimed the life of Magellan, was documented by the Venetian Antonio Pigafetta, whose extensive journal account of the voyage describes its aims and provides enlightening details on the language, customs, and political systems of the various indigenous populations they encountered. It was published a few years after Pigafetta's return to Europe in 1524. Given the fame of this expedition and the general influence of the early historical narratives of the discovery and conquest of the New World, it is not surprising that Brucioli knew about it. Perhaps he chose to include it to maintain some connection to his own times, even with the classical interlocutors, or because these exotic lands far across the ocean were still shrouded in mystery, emphasizing the good place but essential no place aspect of the Greek derivative term utopia. The idea that many unknown societies could exist across hundreds of miles of ocean and that they could be untouched by the problems of Europe made this setting an attractive choice for utopian writers such as Brucioli. As the interlocutor Carmene correctly remarks, there are 5 islands of the Molucca. In chapter 36 of Antonio Pigafetta's lengthy journal account, he takes note of the political systems of each island, 3 of which exist under a monarch and 2 in a government led by the people. Brucioli's Mathien is similar in name to Makien, which has a government led by the people that is in line with the constitution of Brucioli's own ideal republic. Brucioli does not explain why he gave the name Mathien, but perhaps it alludes to the adjective Matthean, di Matteo, which refers to the evangelist Matthew or his gospel, published in, which Brucioli later translated in his Italian version of the New Testament, first published in 1530, and on which he composed a commentary in the 1540s. Another possibility is that he was thinking of the Greek aorist infinitive mathein, which means to learn, especially by inquiry. Near the end of the dialogue, in the 1526 edition, after the account of the climate of the ideal republic, which finishes with a discussion of the benefits of the northern wind, the voyage narrative is inserted. This is followed by an extensive account of the city site and the nature and form of its urban structure, with churches described as centers of learning in which the Bible was taught in the vernacular. The dialogue then concludes with the interlocutors content with what they have discussed and with the outcome of their inquiry, deciding to move on to avoid freezing in the cold. However, the ending unfolds rather differently in the later editions. The account of the city's climate and comment on the northern winds is the same as in the 1526 edition, but the voyage narrative and extensive account of the city site are omitted and replaced by some more succinct concluding remarks. Instead of being content to conclude their inquiry, the interlocutors admit that it is incomplete and that it will only be brought to perfection with the next dialogue on the laws of the Republic, in which the lead interlocutor Trissino hands control over to Gianni Jacopo, who had previously only played a subordinate role in the discussions. There are a number of ways to interpret Brucioli's omission of the voyage narrative and the city site description. It could simply be the result of the streamlining we have seen before, or perhaps there was some religious pressure between the first and second editions to remove the references to churches as learning centers and teaching the Bible in the vernacular. Another explanation, however, for the omission of the fictional voyage narrative, combined with the new contemporary interlocutors and added references to Florence, was that Brucioli wanted to return to the program of realism with which he began the dialogue and which dictated the practical arrangements of this ideal republic. These changes made the dialogue more coherent and consistent in its style and more closely connected to the Florentine context, which was the primary motivation for Brucioli to construct his utopian republic in the first place. In The Prince, Machiavelli famously condemned the kind of theorizing about states that were impossible to achieve, which he saw as inimical to statecraft and which led more often to the ruin of a state than to its preservation. As he says, but being that my intention is to write a useful account, it seemed to me more prudent to focus on the actual truth of the matter than on an imagined version of it, and many have imagined republics and principalities which have never been seen or known to exist in reality. But there is such a gulf between the way people actually live and the way they ought to live that they learn ruin sooner than preservation. In the 1526 version of Brucioli's De Repubblica, even though most of the dialogue describes a practically instituted and feasible republic, the classical setting and fictional voyage narrative resemble the impossibly imagined states criticized by Machiavelli. While this criticism is more applicable to the works in the mold of Thomas More's Utopia, Brucioli's De Repubblica, particularly in the later versions without the voyage narrative and the classical setting, belongs, together with Machiavelli's Prince, to a movement built on the foundations of humanism, but involving a blend of ancient concepts with modern political practice, which the historian Felix Gilbert has labeled the school of modern political realism. The practical changes in the later editions of Brucioli's De Repubblica effectively shrink this gulf that Machiavelli refers to between reality and ideal, to the extent that the two genres of political writing we might consider to be inherently opposed to one another, i.e. utopian fiction and conventional state descriptions, are brought closer together, a phenomena that can be observed in the editorial evolution of this one particular dialogue of Brucioli's. The main ancient source for Brucioli's De Repubblica is undoubtedly Aristotle, whose practical approach to constructing an ideal state is illustrated in this quotation from the opening of Book 2 of the Politics. Here, he sets out the aim of the inquiry, which is the best state for those who are most able to achieve it, i.e. those who live in the polis or city and who are most suited to a life of virtue. He then explains that it is necessary to examine various constitutions, including real states that have existed and theoretical ones that could feasibly exist. These are what we call Aristotle's endoxa, the reputable opinions which he assesses in his dialectical inquiry into the truth being in this case the best state. He finishes by distancing his inquiry from sophistical displays, stating the reason for it is that all current constitutions are faulty and need to be reformed, displaying a typical utopian motivation. In line with Aristotle's method, as well as Machiavelli's critical remarks in The Prince, Brucioli institutes his own practical program for constructing his ideal republic, assessing, quote, those that have been imagined, those republics that have been imagined or could be imagined, and not according to those impossible ones that some have thought up. This passage from the early part of the dialogue is present in the 1526 edition and remains unchanged in the later editions. Aldo Landi, the modern editor of Brucioli's Dialogues on Moral Philosophy, calls this his profession of realism, la professione del realismo, which the voyage narrative does much to contradict. The last line about the fable of poets who don't take into account the diversity of human nature found an echo in the work of a later Italian utopian writer. The early 16th century political philosopher Ludovico Zuccolo put the same criticism regarding human nature directly to Thomas More, whose Utopia, first translated into Italian in 1548, was well known by that time in Italy. Zuccolo wrote 3 utopian dialogues and published them in his own collection of dialogues in 1625. One of these, entitled Aromatario, or The Republic of Utopia, is a systematic polemic against More's Utopia, in which his main criticism is that More didn't take into account the diversity of human nature when constructing his utopia, but instead built a state that imposed a rigid framework on what is naturally discordant and unpredictable, and therefore his model is totally impractical. Zuccolo does, however, praise many of the features of More's utopia and actually defends inquiries such as More's which propose unrealizable ideals, a method which Brucioli's practical Aristotelian approach with its specific Florentine aims does not conform to. Furthermore, in Zuccolo's own utopia, La Repubblica d'Evandria, he addresses More's shortcomings by responding to the criticisms he laid down in the Aromatario. Nevertheless, he includes his own voyage narrative at the start and describes the land of Evandria as residing, quote, in the outermost reaches of Asia, in precisely that part which lies closest to the island of Utopia being More's island of Utopia. In this way, he places his utopia in the same geographic and literary tradition as More's, presenting it as an improved version rather than a different type of inquiry altogether. By contrast, Brucioli, in the later editions of his De Repubblica, did not attempt to improve More's utopian inquiry, but instead to distance himself from it and other works like it. I now want to examine how Brucioli, in light of his practical agenda, constructs his own ideal state in the rest of the dialogue. He begins, following Aristotle in Book 3 of the Politics, by assessing the different types of constitution. For Aristotle, there are three true form governments, which he presents in a favorable light under the right conditions, and three corresponding perversions or deviant forms, which can be observed in the top table. Brucioli's interlocutors discuss 5 types, but none of them are presented with such favorability. This is because they are searching for the one true form which will fulfill their particular aims for a new Florence. For Brucioli, all 5 types are faulty because they create imbalances in wealth, honor, and virtue, which leads to envy, the source of sedition, and the ruin of the state. As Salviati and Trissino demonstrate, by which of these governments do you think the Republic ought to be ruled? And Trissino replies, by none of them, since all these governments in a republic seem to bring with them no small difficulty. The 6th and ideal type of constitution for Florence, according to the interlocutors, is the government of the middle class. To justify this belief, they draw on the Aristotelian ethical doctrine that virtue is a mean between 2 extremes. On this basis, the government of the middle class, who have a mean amount of wealth and external goods, is the best constitution. This is because the imbalances in wealth, honor, and virtue that bring about the fall of the other 5 types of government are not allowed to develop and fester. So the constitution is more stable and the middle class government acts more prudently than a government of one, the few, or the multitude poor ever could. These middle class citizens are held to their middling position of wealth and external goods by the laws and by a group of magistrates whom Brucioli calls the correctors. They are a type of censor who monitor wealth accumulation and expenditure to keep the ruling class citizens at their ideal middle position in order to ensure the stability and survival of the Republic, fostering the Aristotelian virtue of liberality to develop a healthy attitude to wealth among the ruling class who, like all humans, are indeed capable of virtue, but equally so victim to their inherent desire for honor. Brucioli took this type of government from Book 4 of the Politics, in which Aristotle speaks very positively of a middle-class government, even though it does not conform to his ideal standard. He regards it as the best constitution that can be attained under normal conditions. We see here that Aristotle refers to the Nicomachean Ethics for the moral justification that if virtue is at the mean, then the life at the mean must also be equally desirable, just as Brucioli does. Yet this is Aristotle's second best government, not the ideal type, which is the more aristocratically inclined government described in Book 7 and 8 of the Politics. Thus, just as Aristotle expressed his preference for Plato's city of Magnesia from the Laws, as opposed to Callipolis from the Republic, because it was more relevant to 4th century Athens, so Brucioli preferred Aristotle's second best government of the middle class over his ideal type, because it was more adaptable to 16th century Florence. It should be said that Brucioli makes extensive use of Book 7 of the Politics, which contains most of the practical features of Aristotle's account of an ideal state, many of which he adopts. On the fundamental choice of constitution, however, he looks instead to one of the Endoxa, the middle-class government, which Aristotle proposes in Book 4. Brucioli was not the only Florentine to adopt this model. In 1531, the Italian political writer and Republican theorist Donato Gianotti, in his treatise on the government of Florence, promoted the same constitution as Brucioli from Book 4 of the Politics. Gianotti, like Brucioli, was a pupil of Francesco Catani, as he features as an interlocutor in the later editions of Brucioli's Dialogues on Moral Philosophy, which suggests he may have participated in the Rucellai Garden meetings. As we see from this quotation, Gianotti also gives the Aristotelian moral justification of the doctrine of the mean as the basis for his choice of a middle-class government. For both Brucioli and Gianotti, Aristotle's theory of the government of the middle class provided a logically sound and adaptable basis on which to build a state, whether through a return to the golden age of Florence in the 15th century or through borrowing features from the famed Venetian constitution or the Roman Republic. Although Gianotti's treatise was a more conventional state description with reforming objectives, it occasionally exhibits a similar wishful tone to Brucioli, detached from reality, akin to utopian texts such as Brucioli's Della Repubblica. The shared characteristics of these two works, particularly their embodiment of Florentine aspirations and their reliance on Aristotle, suggest that there were not always distinct boundaries between these two genres of political writing, especially in Italian contributions to political thought in the 16th and 17th centuries. I'd like to conclude by drawing attention to other examples of Italian utopias from the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. They do not all employ the dialogue format, nor make extensive use of Aristotle in the same manner as Brucioli. To varying degrees, however, many of them opt for a practical and more grounded ideal, rather than an unattainably perfect one. By considering this largely overlooked tradition, we can not only expand our understanding of early modern utopianism beyond Thomas More and Campanella, but also better appreciate the distinctive aspects of early modern Italian political thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Will. And now I invite all three of you to join me for our questions and answer session. I'd like to remind everyone that to ask a question, you simply need to send it in the chat in either Portuguese or English, though all answers will be given in English. Could we ask each of you a question, then you answer in the same order and so on? Could it be? Okay, so to open the session, I'd like to put a question to each of you, and then I'll read those from the audience following the order of presentations. George, as you mentioned in your talk, Ramus' method achieved great editorial success in the academies of Protestant Europe. Francis Yates, in The Art of Memory, associates this success to Ramus' rejection of the old image-based art of memory, since it would align with the Protestant iconoclasm itself. And yet, behind the same dialectical method, Yates identifies a mystical undercurrent based on reference that Ramus makes to figures from Prisca Theologia, such as Prometheus and Socrates. In his first two books, are like those we often find in Neoplatonic texts. Given this apparent tension between a seemingly rationalist iconoclastic method and a mystical substratum behind it, how do you see Yates' argument, and how do you think it has aged in the historiography sense? And by the way, George, tomorrow is the day Ramus himself was assassinated in 1572.
Is it?
During the San Bartholomew's massacre. I think that adds a certain depth to the discussion, right? Eugenia. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Go on. Okay.
Are you going to ask? Okay, go on.
Yeah, I'll ask all three of you in order, and then you guys answer, okay?
Yeah.
Right. Eugenia, your reading of Borganucci mobilized categories of subjectivity, such as the self, to interpret and understand the text. But in the publishing market of the period, authors not necessarily own the text they produced, being the textual dynamic also shaped by the figure of the editor, for example. Methodologically, how do you handle this use of categories of subjectivity with the collective dimensions of production? And Will, as far as I understood, you attribute the change between the editions to a desire on Brucioli's part to return to the practical agenda of the dialogue. Methodologically, how would you articulate the analysis of his will with the interventions mapped between the editions? And I'm asking this because it seems to me empirically more feasible to demonstrate the interest underlying the act of publication of the work through its effects than the will of the author itself. And if so, would the effects of this change be linked to relations of patronage, besides the political disputes he had been through?
So I'll answer the first one. The question of whether Ramus's elimination of memory from rhetoric has anything to do with his Protestant sympathies. It reflects, as Warburg suggests, a kind of cognitive aniconism. And she says that Ramus accomplishes for the human mind what Luther did for the churches of Middle Europe, whitewashed the walls of the mind. I don't discount there being some kind of elective affinity between Ramos's imageless dialectic and his Protestant outlook, although there is some controversy about whether he had begun his conversion to Protestantism already in the early 1540s when he wrote the Dialectica. It seems to be doubtful, and he does continue to allow the worship of images in the Collège de Nevers, so in the Collège de Presles, where he was the chair. Peter Mack has pointed out that the art of memory was marginal already within university teaching by the early 16th century, because the rhetoric at Herennium had been exposed as apocryphal. And in any case, if you look at the classical works of rhetoric and dialectic, the Cicero, Quintilian, Boethius, they have nothing to say really about memory or about these visual techniques that Yeats writes about as having an afterlife in Renaissance esotericism. I think Ramos is very much a creature of the university. So by the time that he gets around to eliminating memory from rhetoric, it had already fallen away, and Melanchthon also abolished memory from the teaching of dialectic and rhetoric outfitting both. So I think would love to say that Yeats is right, but I think it's one of those cases where she's maybe letting speculation run away from the actual evidence of text and the practices.
Okay, thank you, George.
Thank you, Lucas, for your question. It's quite challenging, actually, because as you said, authorship can involve multiple figures in the Renaissance and in the printing era. So in the case of self-translated text, we see editors sometimes even claiming that they had written the author's works, while it's not the truth. Sometimes editor lies to gain more profit, and so they take an author's self-translated version and they attribute it to themselves. There are some collaborative self-translation as well. It's not only the author self-translating, but there are other figures who could be relatives, helpers, pupils. There are also pseudo self-translations when an author lies about the identity or works that they have been claimed to have been produced, but they weren't. So we really need to be as inclusive as possible in this case, because the figure of the self-translator is quite nuanced. There could be multiple figures behind them. So thank you for your question.
Thank you, Eugenia.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Lucas. It's something that I've been asked before when I've given a similar paper and spoken about this before. I think the mention of patronage and the fact that first that it's quite difficult to judge the will of Antonio Brucioli, who's writing in the 16th century, hundreds of years ago. It's quite a difficult thing to try and judge and assume that that's his will for it to be more practical. But I'd say the other sort of possibilities, one of them, which is the obvious one, is that all of the religious pressure that he was, under during that time. I mentioned his 3 trials for heresy. He's under consistent pressure from the Inquisition to kind of, either stop writing altogether or, edit his works, as many people had to do. They have to, republish things with these different changes. And then also the problem of patronage, because of all the negative attention he received from the Inquisition. He was very poor, and he was living a tough life, so to speak. And And when he republished all of his dialogues, including the other dialogues on metaphysics and human philosophy, he published them in kind of separate books in collected volumes. And each book of dialogues had its own patron. So he was constantly, calling out to these other people for some kind of support. So I guess in that sense it did that. And also, but there's a curious thing. After he's exiled from Florence in 1529, he becomes a spy for the Medici in Venice while he's in Venice in order to, better his financial position. Yet, interestingly enough, the dialogue seems to, through the changes that I discussed, it becomes more overtly a kind of reforming statement for the city, for Florence, rather than being this kind of imaginary thing that's, looking at the new world for a new place to sing, and it's all very kind of subtle allusions, but it comes much more kind of obviously a reaction to the Florentine political situation and a reaction to the aristocrats and specifically to the Medici, who are, essentially operating a one-man rule in Florence, which is a curious thing because you'd think it would be the other way around. If he's working for the Medici, his dialogues would become slightly more tame and less kind of attacking. So, I mean, you could interpret that as some kind of will of his, but like you said, it's difficult to judge. But even if you take out this element of, assuming that's Brucioli's own feeling or will, the changes the dialogue undergoes, which I discussed, do make it more practical anyway. Stylistically, it becomes a more practical thing because of the change in context, because of the things I discussed, even if we can't say with any kind of certainty that Brucioli was, consciously wanting it to be more practical in that sense. But it does become that anyway, regardless of that being his will or not.
Thank you, Will. And before we continue with the questions of the audience, I would like to say that our coordinator, Professor Cássio Fernandes, said in our chat that he's present and he's thanking you guys for this excellent and very important lectures for the group of Brazilian researchers present here. In particular, it was very important for colleagues who studied these topics related to the Cinquecento. And now moving on to the questions from the audience. The first one comes from Professor Luis Sérgio de Sá, and he's asking George, first of all, he says, "Thank you very much for the presentation and congratulations on your work on the Ciceronianos. I'm really looking forward to reading it. Your talk reminded me of an observation by Brian Vickers, who argued that to write the history of rhetoric merely from the textbooks may be deeply misleading, since rhetoric was much more a practice than epistemology. Even textbooks themselves were, so to speak, written rhetorically and always as target-oriented actions. This requires to pay close attention to the historicity of the vocabularies being used and to the audience being addressed. So, two questions. First, could you say a little more about the social context as the editorial context of the arguments developed by Reymond? And second, could you tell us a bit about the audience to whom these dialectical considerations were addressed and the practice meaning with this science to his public? There's a question now for Eugenia. It comes from Gian Ramos, and he says, "I'd like to begin by congratulating all the speakers on their very interesting presentations. I have a question for Dr. Eugenia Sisto, and the question is, to what extent can we speak of self-translation in early modern period without presupposing a transhistorical conception of the self? And I'm thinking here of Mose and Lévi-Strauss' reflection on the historicity and variability of categories such as person, individual, and subject. Would it not therefore be important to distinguish between the historical practice of self-translation and the contemporary analytical category of the self-translators, precisely in order to avoid projecting onto early modern writers not only a contemporary conception of subjectivity, but also a contemporary understanding of writing as a space for expressing personal experience?" And also to Eugenia, Professor Luis César says, "Eugenia, what struck me in your talk was the dialogue between categories we use today and their possible relevance to the early modern period. As you point out, much of the literature on self-translation stems from 20th century literary questions, like Kundera, Eco, Joyce, and reveals a strong concern with the self, a notion that is in fact widely used in Renaissance studies. But these categories are not native to the period. Likewise, the idea of a geographic or self-translation raises some difficulties. Take exile, for instance. Self-exile is tied to expectations of interpretation that may be quite different from our own. For example, the emulation of the poetic authority associated with the Roman exile. So in this sense, might identity and self-translation be more of a topoi than an expression of the subject inner self and personal concerns? And when you say that Borganucci vernacular language is straightforward and written in an understandable style, do you mean that is not rhetorical in the sense that is detached from the use of a precise technique? Still on this point, how should we define the idea of translation crossing boundaries if we take into account the fact that for humanists, the linguistic boundaries were arguably the Republica Literarium itself, in Grafton sense, that is, a coalition of scholars whose identity extend beyond the borders of political authority nor institutional geographies. And Will, Cynthia sent us a question, and she says, given the Aristotelian inclination of the work, would the title De la Repubblica contain any satire of Plato's Republic? And would this formula that only imagined or imaginal republics can be evaluated, refusing the impossible ones, correspond to a deliberate refusal on Brucioli's part of Platonic reasoning of pure idealization?
Should I answer the first question?
Please, George.
First of all, thank you very much for this. And I definitely take the point that I haven't heeded Brian Vickers' advice, and I have been reading these texts as if they were purely theoretical works on epistemology, which is definitely against the grain of their intention. I recognize the textbooks produced by Ramus and Talon during the 1540s and 1550s were part of an editorial blitzkrieg to undermine the authority of what they saw as Aristotelianized conservative establishment at the University of Paris, and we can choose whether or not to accept their propaganda, their framing of this campaign. The work that I'm editing at the moment by Ramus with my collaborator Emma Wilson at Texas State is a biography of Cicero adapted from a series of 10 public lectures that were given by Ramus to students at the Collège de Presles, but also to the broader academic community of the University of Paris. And it is a highly polemical, almost invective work, which nonetheless does try to communicate the Ramus program through the medium of Cicero's education. It's a very strange kind of text. So I take the point that Ramus was not a theorist of knowledge. What I would say though is that Ramus's method was received as such. You can take Ramus's claim, reading as a 21st century scholar, that his method can give you absolute objective knowledge of everything without any imperfection, with a grain of salt. But the disciples of Ramus definitely thought that this was the case. If you look at encyclopedias by German Ramists or Swiss Ramists like Johann Henrik Alsted, who I mentioned in the presentation, and Schringer in his Theatrum Mundi, they use this system of invention and disposition on pretty much everything that they can think of. And they demonstrate Ramos's method as if to prove that for them it could, if you use the system, gain knowledge, perfect knowledge, certain knowledge of everything in the world. So I don't think it's entirely unjustified to use Ramos's texts to talk about a kind of epistemic rupture that they enacted, because they were certainly received very enthusiastically by Ramos's disciples as he presented them, albeit when he did make these arguments, he was doing so, as Beckers would say, in a very polemical, rhetorical context. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, George.
Thank you so much for the question. There's so much to think about and so much to say. I'll start from the first question. I'll try to be as comprehensive but as short as possible. There's definitely a risk of anachronism when using self-translation and applying it to the early modern period. We need to be very careful about using it, as early modern authors didn't use it themselves. However, as also the second question appointed, the self was becoming more explicitly individual and introspective during the Renaissance time, as many studies have underlined, like Greenblatt's studies. There's something interesting that we can say about the way that early modern authors thought about their own process of self-translating. There's Henri Estienne, a French author, who spoke about being himself his own interpreter. So there's definitely a sense of trying to render as close as possible a linguistic version to our own idea and our own subjectivity. But I think self-translation, and this is very true, we need to be careful when we use this term, self-translation in the early modern time didn't offer the same space of subjectivity as self-translation does nowadays for contemporary authors. And I hope I answered the first question. And regarding the second one, I think I definitely think that we need to be careful about also talking about geographical displacements and applying it to self-translation in the early modern time. When I say that Borgarucci's vernacular language is straightforward and written in understandable style, I mean that he uses allusions and references to everyday life to make the reading more fluent and easy to access for a common reader, but Borgarucci definitely uses some technique, even if he's using the vernacular and not the Latin language. And I found particularly interesting the idea of crossing boundaries. The Italian scenario, and this is maybe something that it's worth mentioning, and I should have mentioned before, in the 16th century is quite dynamic, because there were different vernaculars and different political regions. So in a sense, what Italian authors were trying to do at that time was creating an Italian identity to confront and level up to other European countries. So I think, especially in Italian authors, and especially in Borgarucci, who also was involved in this language debate, there was definitely a question of creating a national identity. For this reason, maybe for the Italian case, we can talk about crossing boundaries, because Italian authors were trying to create their own space, identity, and boundary to distinguish themselves from the rest of Europe. And having said so, I think I'm gonna focus more on this concept of exile and movements applied to the early modern self-translation, because it's super interesting and deserves much more exploration. I hope I was, clear enough.
Thank you, Eugenia. It certainly was. Will, please.
Yeah. The first question from Cynthia. A satire on Plato's Republic. I mean, that would be quite sort of interesting if he was doing that, I guess. But I think it's more of, I mean, they often use Republica or Republic to refer kind of generally to, from the Greek politeia, to be just a commonwealth or kind of a constitution in general. It's a non-specific type of government. But then also Republica means republic in the more specific sense, or a republican constitution, which is, got different characteristics to the other commonwealths. There might be a kingship or an aristocracy or an oligarchy, etc. But, it's more about kind of, a bigger middle class, a kind of wider multitude of political participation. There's certain features which set it out as a republic. And I think Brucioli is definitely talking about a republic in that sense. So we think of the Republic of Venice, or the Republican periods that Florence enjoyed in the 15th century and in the 16th century. So I think, it would be quite interesting if he was making a little dig at Plato, but I think in this sense he's not. And the second part of the question about a deliberate refusal and pure idealization, I think, yes, it is a deliberate refusal, perhaps not just of Plato, but that kind of practice in general, that kind of style. I mean, he's adopting the Aristotelian approach by, which he, kind of practically quotes almost verbatim in the discussion of his own method to theorizing of an ideal state. But I mean, he's not completely, against Plato in his whole kind of, his whole outlook and in his writings. I mean, perhaps not in the dialogue on the Republic, but in the succeeding dialogue on the laws of the Republic, which I sort of mentioned very briefly. He's much more fond of Plato's laws, and he draws on it much more extensively. And the Republic is not really Plato's Republic. It's not really something he considers. I mean, the common kind of thing that these authors do is they do a criticism of, the idea of sharing all public goods and, and having this kind of, sort of communism or semi-communism, as we might call it, which Plato proposes in the Republic. And they often, Brucioli and Aristotle and other authors often criticize this, perhaps not as a direct attack on Plato, but as a criticism of those kind of ideas which stem from the Republic. But in terms of Plato's laws, Brucioli is much more sympathetic and much more willing to adopt features. I mean, the thing I mentioned in the presentation about Aristotle in Book 2 of the Politics, he's much more complimentary of the city of Magnesia in Plato's laws, rather than the city of Callipolis in the Republic, precisely because it's more practically orientated and feasible. So there's a kind of mirroring between Brucioli and Aristotle and how they approach theorizing an ideal state, and then also how it might reflect their attitude to Plato at the same time. And the second question,
George. Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay, George. Oh, are we going back?
I think now we're moving on to the second round of questions, right?
Oh yeah, sorry, I'd already thought about
That's
that
all
one.
right.
No, go start again.
Well, moving on to this second round. So, George, since is asking you like this, following the idea that Ramus cannot be reduced to the Protestantism, and given the disagreements between Ramus' method and his Aristotelian critiques in relation to the reaffirmation of the scholastic legacy, is it possible to read this controversy in the context of the Counter-Reformation? Also, Cynthia, for you, Eugenia, Professor Cássio Fernandes, he says that he would like to hear more about how Burgarucci can be linked to the contemporary process of using the vernacular language in Italy. And he asks, how does the process of identity construction and self-representation occur in this Italian context where regional cultures still prevail in the Cinquecento? And lastly, Professor Cássio Fernandes says, I would like to hear from you regarding Brucioli's possible reference to the tradition of Florentine republicanism in the 14th and 15th century.
So to answer Cynthia's question, Ramism was a phenomenon of the Protestant universities, academies, gymnasia. It had a very limited penetration south of the Alps. Marcus Garbi in, I think, Pisa has written about the phenomenon of Italian Ramism, but it was certainly a very rare phenomenon. So I think it's hard to read how, at least I don't have the evidence to hand to speak on how Ramism was received in the context of the Counter-Reformation, but it's something that I should think about. I mean, Ramus himself, very quickly after his murder at the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, was elevated into a Huguenot martyr. So I imagine that would have militated against his ideas having any kind of significant adoption by Counter-Reformation thinkers, where I think, as the question suggests, Aristotelianism still remained the dominant paradigm of dialectic.
Thank you, George.
And thank you for the question regarding the contemporary process of using the vernacular language in Italy. I really like this question because most of my PhD thesis focused exactly on this topic. The Italian authors of the 16th century were involved, many of them, in the Questione della Lingua, language debates, as I mentioned before, was aiming to find a unified literary Italian language. So the process of identity construction and self-representation was very important for these authors. They were trying to select the best vernacular they could among all the multiple vernaculars available in Italy at that time. And for instance, there were Florentine authors who sponsored the Florentine vernacular, or there were Lombard authors who preferred the Lombard vernacular. And we can see that regional small realities were trying to make their linguistic identity prevail over other options. And I think it's a very important way to look at self-translation in Italy specifically at this time, because it's pretty much connected to questions of identity and national identity at this time.
Thank you, Eugenia. Well, it seems we had some technical issues here.
Okay.
Do you mind starting over?
Yeah, sorry, there's a bit of a clash of the laptops there. No, thank you very much for the interesting question. I actually have a section in my chapter specifically on this, specifically on 15th century Florentine republicanism and the idea that Brutuli may be indeed looking back to this period as a kind of golden age for Florence, and therefore a model he would like to implement in his contemporary mid-16th century environment. The kind of model we see in Leonardo Bruni's writings, specifically the Laudatio of the city of Florence from very early on in the 15th century. And there are some kind of similarities between the two, but they're more kind of commonplace features of generally of a Republican government, kind of widespread political participation, a kind of system of laws, a kind of equality of a kind of middle class type government, nobody's too rich, nobody's too poor, there's a kind of equality there. But they're quite subtle. I mean, they're not too kind of obviously looking back. I've had to kind of talk quite generally about that. I mean, the author Donato Gianotti, who I mentioned in the PowerPoint, who also implemented or chose to implement the middle class government from Book 4 of Aristotle's Politics. He makes he's writing a different kind of text that's, exists from a different genre, but he makes very explicit criticisms of the more recent Florentine Republican governments before the Medici, and then between the Medici when they're no longer in Florence before they're restored. But it's a slightly more recent kind of reference and more of a criticism rather than a kind of looking back at this golden period. I mean, one author that does also look at is Guicciardini, who's slightly more well known than Gianotti, who more directly engages with the kind of Republican features that would be kind of renowned to somebody who wanted to implement that kind of slightly more popular form of republic. But I think in general, Brucioli is more concerned with, even there might be some similarities between those things, he's more concerned with the kind of very immediate past, being the few years surrounding his kind of exile from the city, rather than kind of looking back. He doesn't make any explicit references. And out of everything, it's really Aristotle and Machiavelli who are his two main sources for constructing his ideal republic. And the similarities with Florentine governments before are kind of, slightly more commonplace. He doesn't make explicit references as some of these other Italian political writers do, but there are definitely similarities for sure.
Thank you, Will. And with this last answer, and given the time, I believe we should bring today's session to a close. On the behalf of the Warburg and Renaissance Research Group and Professor Cássio Fernandes, I thank you all very much for such stimulating presentation and for this rediscussion. I'd like to close this conference cycle by thanking once again our three speakers, George, Eugenia, and Will, for sharing their research with us and for engaging so generously with the questions of the audience. I'd also like to thank the Warburg and Renaissance Group, and of course, Cynthia Chaves, my co-organizer. Finally, thank you all for joining us today on our YouTube channel. This concludes our session for today. Thank you very much, and I wish you all a great day.